Hello, everyone. My name is Sandy McDonald, and I am the co-founder and executive director of the International Association for Premenstrual Disorders, or IAPMD. Today, we are having this community webinar to discuss the Nettle and PMDD and what the research says, and we will follow that up with a Q&A. We are joined today by Dr. Emilé Radyte. She is the founder of Samphire Neuroscience, which is the company that has created the Nettle. At IAPMD, our mission is to provide support, education, and advocacy to help people affected by premenstrual disorders. Our vision is to empower people with premenstrual disorders to find hope, relief, and resources. Since our founding in 2013, we have helped over 1.5 million people from approximately 100 countries find answers, community, and hope. We have resources available for purchase. You can check the QR code and that'll take you to the shop to be able to purchase those if you are interested. We have the PMDD Treatment Options ebook, and we have Hope, a guide for PMDD partners and caregivers written by Erin Kinghorn. A disclaimer, all proceeds from both of these books go to support our mission at IAPMD. A disclosure statement, IAPMD carefully selects experts to host webinars. Please note that the speaker's statements do not necessarily reflect the views of IAPMD or the IAPMD Clinical Advisory Board. And a financial disclosure statement, use of promo code IAPMD15 when purchasing a Nettle device provides a financial contribution to IAPMD similar to an affiliate link. Sharing this offer does not constitute an endorsement of the Nettle device by IAPMD or IAPMD's Clinical Advisory Board. Preliminary findings are being shared for educational purposes only, and further research is needed to assess its effectiveness as a treatment option for PMDD. Before we start, I just want to make mention that there's the chat option, the Q&A option, or the raise hand option. Please also note that unfortunately, we are unable to answer any questions regarding attendees' individual health circumstances. This is because legal and ethical guidelines prevent our presenters and clinicians from giving medical advice to specific people in the context of those presentations. Feel free to ask general or hypothetical questions that are not asking for medical advice. I'm going to turn it over to Em now, so let's get started.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Neuroscience of Premenstrual Dysphoric Disorder, PMDD, today with myself that we're running in collaboration with the International Association for Premenstrual Disorders. Thanks so much for taking the time out of your day to chat through these. To get into it straight away, my name is Dr. Emilé Radyte. First and foremost, I am a neuroscientist. I was trained in Harvard for my undergraduate in neuroscience and anthropology. Followed by my master's in Oxford University for psychiatry, engineering, and neuroscience as well. And throughout my career, have always focused around studying the brain at the intersection of what we know about cognition, as well as how to manage when things might go wrong. As an emergency medic, I've worked over 4 years on the front lines in Massachusetts as well, which really gave me a focus on making sure that all of the research that I've been running for that many years is actually translatable into real world evidence and actually makes a difference into people's lives. So you'll see that perspective permeating across the talk. And I'm also the founder and CEO of an NGO, Integrative Neuroscience Association, where we educate people about the importance of neuroscience and the relevance of it in their everyday lives, so it is more accessible, and Samphire Neuroscience that develops medical devices across the board in order to improve women's health and well-being. A couple of disclaimers before we get started is that Samphire Neuroscience, the company that I co-founded and lead, develops and commercially distributes the Nettle and the Luteal device. Presenters such as myself have a financial interest in this product as a shareholder, as well as the leader of the company and an employee in the company. The device, Nettle, is CE marked. It's a Class 2A medical device in the EU and the UK, and it is marketed for managing menstrual pain and mood symptoms. So it is approved for that use and can be prescribed by clinicians as well. Its specific use for PMDD is still being investigated, and we will share some preliminary findings today that do require further study and are here just for informational and educational purposes only. As above, the presentation is for those educational purposes only and is not medical or clinical advice. So all individuals should consult with a qualified healthcare provider before making treatment decisions. And finally, IAPMD, the partner for this talk, does not endorse the device, but you can use the promo code IAPMD15, which will provide a financial contribution to IAPMD as well if you chose to explore neurotechnology for your treatment journey as well. And now, without further ado, let's dive into today's agenda. So today we'll speak about quite a few different topics. We will start by covering barriers to PMDD diagnosis. For many people living with premenstrual dysphoric disorder, many of these will not be new, but they're incredibly important to cover as they are reflective of our current treatment landscape. Then we'll dive into the neuroscience of PMDD, focusing on two aspects of the brain, neurotransmitters on the one hand and brain circuitry on the other. We will then dive deeper into neuromodulation for PMDD. It will be a deep dive into research data that we have from our preliminary clinical research, as well as our ongoing post-market surveillance with the Nettle device, so evidence with real-world users as well. We'll briefly discuss about accessing options, kind of how, if you have PMDD, you could seek out treatment from different modalities and make sure you are getting the care you deserve. And then we'll dive into a deeper Q&A as well. There is a small warning that there are sensitive health topics that will be covered during this talk, including self-harm. So just an awareness in case that is a topic of sensitivity for any listeners out there. So let's start to speak about barriers to PMDD diagnosis. So things that might mean that someone doesn't get diagnosed on time or may not realize they have PMDD when they actually do. And the first category of reasons is individual. So things that are related to your own body. And fundamentally, PMDD is a very complex hormone-brain interaction. What we mean by that, and we'll dive into that deeper across the talk, is that PMDD is understood to be primarily neurobiological sensitivity to hormones by the brain, not a hormone disorder altogether. What we mean by that is that most people with PMDD will actually have normal hormone levels if they were to get tested, like endocrine tested by an endocrinologist, but they still have this abnormal response to that hormone change. And as a result, this complexity can be quite confusing for an individual to understand right away that that's what's happening, because the hormone level seems fine, but that response may not be exactly that way as well. This is also linked to the fact that up until very recently, most people lacked routine cycle tracking. So most people, when they thought about their menstrual cycles, they would just think of their period, which is the first day of their menstrual cycle when you bleed, because it's the day you're most aware of your symptoms. However, cycle tracking requires tracking both your period, so day one of your cycle, but also when your symptoms might emerge and what the pattern in those symptoms is. And you really need to track it above 2 cycles in order to qualify for a PMDD diagnosis in most countries and most jurisdictions, depending on where you live. But also, most importantly, you need to track it over probably many more in order to realize that that pattern is there. Because PMDD, and obviously this is an audience that is quite aware of it, but PMDD is characterized by symptoms of low mood, anxiety, irritability, impulsivity, as well as potentially self-harm and suicidal thoughts in the 2 or so weeks leading up to your period and the later luteal phase. And so many people might be experiencing these symptoms, but not realizing that they repeat every single month or every single cycle and see that pattern right away unless they have that cycle tracking. And then that's obviously supplemented by the fact that validated tools for this diagnosis remain limited as well. And menstrual data is often not included in electronic or medical records. So even if you were to track that information, there's no way for your clinician usually to report for that, or most clinicians wouldn't be asking for it as well. And finally, there's also symptom misattribution, is that because of this confusion of what might be happening and a lot of people not necessarily being aware of their cycles, they might be experiencing these symptoms, but not realizing that they are linked to these hormonal related patterns. And so, especially because a lot of these symptoms overlap with other mood disorders, such as the major depressive disorder, MDD, which is the technical term for depression, but also anxiety, so generalized anxiety disorder. Also, a lot of people might get a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, other diagnoses like ADHD, etc., personality disorders, and things like that. And a lot of those symptoms can usually be explained by PMDD. Sometimes the conditions will be comorbid or overlapping, but in many cases, they might be separate diagnoses. And a lot of PMDD patients will have gone through lots of different diagnoses prior to settling in with this final diagnosis as well. So those are kind of the main individual barriers to be aware of. And then there are a lot of societal barriers to be just aware of in the context of trying to pursue getting a diagnosis, especially if you suspect that you might have that diagnosis available. So there's obviously gender bias and historical undervaluation of women's symptoms. What we mean by that is that historically, when women complained of premenstrual symptoms, so anything that they notice happening before their period, there is a general stigma around it, or an understanding that that is something that is normal and experienced by all women. And while it is estimated that about 90% of women will experience premenstrual symptoms to some extent, for the vast majority of women, they will be more manageable than for others. And for about 30% of women, we see that they're incredibly severe, such that they probably require management because it is interfering with their quality of life. So that bias definitely fits into the way that people respond to you. And it also means that a lot of people don't speak about it, both to themselves, they might not be willing to admit it, also their support networks, but most importantly, their clinicians. And when clinicians are not being trusted with that information, they're also often not recording it. And therefore, there's very limited record on, the overall spread of these conditions and their awareness, and obviously a lack of treatment options and awareness of how widespread it might be. This is also linked to what we discussed before, the limited clinician awareness of it, is that because, as we spoke a bit before, it is a response of the brain to the normal hormonal processes, it is usually not very well positioned within one clinical specialty. So a lot of, for example, psychiatrists are not very well trained in hormonal science in order to be able to respond and notice these patterns. So they might diagnose, your mood disorder as a mood disorder, as opposed to realizing that there is a cyclical pattern to it. Whereas a lot of gynecologists may not have extensive psychiatric training and not recognize that, for example, some of those mental health symptoms are actually related to gynecological conditions that are related there, and treat them as separate. So there's quite a bit of disparity in clinician training and awareness across the board. And PMDD is still not part of medical school training for the vast majority of clinicians. And in my experience working with patients for the last 5 or so years, is that most patients are generally much more aware and educated than their clinicians, and actually do a lot of heavy lifting in educating and bringing their clinicians along the journey in learning more about PMDD. And also, in that same vein, whenever patients do try to educate their clinicians, we do sometimes see that it is dismissed as, oh, it's just normal PMS or stress. So a lot of patients really need to advocate for themselves with both real world evidence, such as collecting their own cycle data and tracking it over time and validating it. But also, obviously, science should be there to support them further. And research is rapidly emerging for PMDD as a field. And finally, limited access to specialists and treatment is, of course, an issue across the board with medical care, but it is especially so for PMDD because, as I mentioned before, it requires specialized care, it requires the awareness from the patient, and it usually requires quite a long clinical journey to understand that relationship between hormonal change and the brain's response to it. And it requires quite good coordination and awareness between the clinician team that is taking care of you in order to give you the best resources. And generally, it is very poorly covered by insurance for the vast majority of people because it falls in between the cracks of these traditional conditions. So, as discussed before, we see that a lot of people with lacking kind of institutional and societal support self-diagnose. A lot of people use IAPMD resources, but also a lot of people who just track their own cycles and then seek their own treatments as well. So all of those kind of comprise barriers of why only 3 to 8% of people are aware that they have PMDD. The numbers are probably higher than that. And a general way of realizing whether or not you have it is exactly tracking your cycles for repeated months and just realizing whether your pattern is repetitive and whether it has the severity of the symptoms that are described in PMDD criteria. And there's lots of resources that you can use for that. So let's dive deeper about what's actually happening in PMDD in the brain, because we know it's the brain sensitivity to hormones. So let's understand what's happening there. Firstly, it's really important to understand how a cycle looks like. As I mentioned before, most people think of just the first day that they bleed. However, your cycle is all of the days of your menstrual cycle. And every single day along your menstrual cycle is actually characterized by a different pattern of activity happening across your brain. So if you look at a calendar, the rough way of thinking about it is that the first half of your menstrual cycle is the follicular phase, and then the second half of your menstrual cycle is the luteal phase, and then the middle point is the ovulation. That's when the egg ovulates from the ovarian cycle line that you can see on the graph. And then we know that the next cycle begins with your menstruation, so day 1 of your bleeding between the luteal and the follicular phase. And all of the changes that are happening across the board in your body are quite extensive. Some most notable changes is that halfway through your menstrual cycle after you ovulate, your general basal body temperature will lift. If you are using wearables such as natural cycles or Aura or any other type of wearable that tracks your basal body temperature, you will notice that after you ovulate, your temperature lifts. So your temperature is usually always higher in the luteal phase compared to your follicular phase. Then you obviously have the egg maturing, ovulating during the luteal phase, and then degrading in the luteal phase if it wasn't fertilized. You have the uterine lining thickening throughout the menstrual cycle and preparing for potential implantation. And then we get rid of it during menstruation if implantation hasn't occurred. And most interestingly, we have hormones shifting every day across our menstrual cycle. So if we look at that third panel from the top, and the most important hormones to look into here are really estrogen and progesterone, which we generally govern the menstrual cycle, though there's obviously a lot of other key players involved without whom nothing would be happening. But if you look at estrogen, that's marked in gray in this panel. And you can see that estrogen generally rises across the follicular phase. So the follicular phase tends to be dominated by estrogen. And then the luteal phase is characteristic because that's when your progesterone peaks and really is present there, whereas progesterone levels are relatively negligible for the vast majority of people in the follicular phase. So it is safe to say that the luteal phase, when we see a lot of these PMDD symptoms come up, is dominated by progesterone, and that's the most kind of important hormonal player in the game at that time. The reason that's important is if you look at just correlations alone across the luteal phase for most people, is that we see that if we look at any condition that has been linked to hormonal change alongside the menstrual cycle, the vast majority of those vulnerabilities are exactly in the luteal phase. So we can see the PMS phase, which is usually the last week before your period, the perimenstrual phase that also includes the first few days of your menstrual cycle, PMDD, where symptoms also often start a little bit earlier, for many people very soon after ovulation as well. But we also see it that, a lot of people might see relapse and psychosis, seizures, migraines, asthma exacerbations, not mentioned here, but we also see that there's increase in potential relapse for substance use disorder. Also for ADHD, we see oftentimes that symptoms worsen around that luteal phase as well. And we can see that there are pretty much no conditions that have been identified as getting worse during the follicular phase when we know estrogen is dominating. So all of that says to us that, one, we know that a lot of these conditions are something of the brain's response to hormones, but also we see that it's quite localized across the menstrual cycle. It's not like each bit of the menstrual cycle is characterized by its own issues. It is characterized by its own patterns, but most of the kind of mental health concerns that we tend to spot and other conditions that tend to aggravate in that luteal phase when progesterone is the most dominant hormone there is. And so we'll dive deeper into that a little bit. Before we go into hormones and breaking down what exactly progesterone might be doing, it is important to understand that there are no hormones without the brain. In recent years, there has been a lot of debate of, dysregulated hormones, et cetera. And a lot of people might have unregulated or unusually regulated hormones and things like that. But for the vast majority of women with PMDD, they will be ovulating normally, they will be menstruating normally, and they will generally have regular hormone levels. It's just how their brain responds to it. And the reason for that is that the brain is a critical control center for every single hormone in your body. So if you look at the brain, there's a key part of the brain called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is a part of the brain that essentially gives the signal to produce hormones in order for the body to ovulate. So it does so by communicating with the anterior pituitary gland, which is part of the brain as well as the endocrine system. It's at the interface of the two. And then that gives the signal to the female ovaries to produce estrogen and progesterone particularly. And that's called the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis to describe all of the different parts of the system. And so that's essentially the axis or the communication channel by which the brain tells the body what to do, in this case, produce hormones so that the body can ovulate. But then the body also needs to tell the brain that it has produced those hormones. So that's where we see that last arrow coming up back to the brain and giving what we call feedback, negative feedback to the brain, essentially saying, look, you told me to produce hormones. The hormones have been produced. We've ovulated. Stop sending the signal. And that's how the brain every single month gives a signal for the egg to ovulate and then gets a signal back that the egg has ovulated, everything's fine, and we proceed this way as well. So whenever you have issues in kind of hormonal regulation, oftentimes they might actually also be traced back to the brain. It's the brain not having given the right signal. So it's always very important to understand that whenever you may or may not have a hormonal issue, the brain is always in that loop, because the brain is the bit of your body that gives your body a signal to produce hormones, to ovulate, not to ovulate if you have too much stress, for example. And so it is always part of the conversation. So, if you take away one thing from this entire lecture, is that there is no way of treating a hormonal issue without understanding how the brain interacts and controls it as well. And so if you look at the brain, what is actually really special is that in order to get that signal back from the body to know that it has produced enough hormones, it needs to be sensitive to hormones, because that it needs to sense that they have been released. And so in here, you can see a picture that essentially shows where estrogen and progesterone receptors are in the brain. So you can see estrogen receptors in red and progesterone receptors in black. And one thing you'll notice relatively quickly is that it's not like the whole brain is sensitive to estrogen and progesterone. So it's not like all parts of the brain are equally sensitive of whether enough estrogen and progesterone has been produced. Actually, there are specific parts of the brain that are particularly sensitive to changes in estrogen and progesterone. And if you look, you'll notice that there are kind of these two big clusters. One is this cluster deeper in the brain, in what we call the limbic system. And then the other cluster is there in the frontal cortex, outlined towards the left corner of the image as well. And the reason that these are so special is because the limbic system is generally associated with our core emotions. So that's what we call our quote lizard brain. So it's kind of our basic feelings that we feel and emotions that control and manage us as humans. So it's the same part that is preserved from other animals and is responsible for fear, such as in the amygdala region, for memory, such as in the hippocampus. It's responsible for pleasure and knowing what we enjoy and seeking those behaviors out. It's kind of our basic impulses and emotions. And then the frontal cortex is very interesting because that's a part of the brain that is very higher up and that is quite uniquely human, which allows us to control impulses and emotions. At a high level, the frontal cortex is responsible for executive control, decision making. So with all the information you have, what decision should you make? And in many ways, a lot of people consider the frontal cortex to be the core of who you are, because two people with the same information might make a different decision and make a different choice. And so the frontal cortex really, by helping you make those choices based on the information you have, is your ability of essentially controlling your emotions and responding to them. And that is also uniquely human, because animals just do whatever their impulse is. If they're scared, they run. If they want something, they do it. Whereas us humans, we have these sophisticated levels of, saying, just because I want to scream and shout right now, I'm in this busy place and there's no reason for me to do it. And your essentially frontal cortex and limbic system are always in communication and balance with each other. And a normal behavior, a normal kind of human operation, the limbic system of your brain, which is responsible for these core emotions, needs to always be controlled by the frontal cortex. So the frontal cortex needs to always help the limbic system interpret whether an action is appropriate or not based on these core desires that you have. And so it is interesting that specifically that control and specifically those emotions are the ones that are sensitive to hormone change. And if you think about that one step deeper, it makes sense. If you think of people who have estrogen sensitivity or progesterone sensitivity, and definitely people with PMDD or severe PMS symptoms and stuff like that, we will notice that the vast majority of symptoms are related to emotional control in particular. So think of symptoms like low mood, anxiety, irritability, impulsivity. All of these, when you hear them as a neuroscientist, you hear that they're something related about not being able to decide how to feel or not being able to respond in an otherwise rational way to emotional demands of the system. So it kind of starts to map this picture of us knowing that in the brain, there are specific subparts of the brain that are sensitive to these hormones, and those specific parts are reflective of the types of symptoms that we see. And so people were very interested in understanding, okay, we know that these symptoms tend to occur in the luteal phase, and so we know they're linked to progesterone sensitivity. But how exactly do they happen? And I'll walk through a brief history about how we found out about these mechanisms of PMDD. And there were three main dominant theories in the space around it. So the first one was called the progesterone theory. Pretty straightforward. We know that progesterone is higher up in the luteal phase, and that's when all the symptoms happen. So maybe progesterone is the one at fault here. This was a compelling theory because we knew that when we put women with PMDD, and I'm sure many of you have had that experience, But if you try combined hormonal contraceptives or gonadotropin-releasing hormone therapies, they tend to generally work. And so people were quite excited because it seemed that whenever you interfered with the estrogenic system and with the progesterone system, that it made a difference to PMDD symptoms. However, it kind of became suspicious and not very clear whether that's the actual mechanism, because the effects could also be explained by just the fact that you're not having regular periods. Because if you are on either of those therapies, you are not experiencing the regular menstrual cycle hormonal shift that we would expect someone to go through. So is it really that you're just changing what's happening with estrogen, or is it just the fact that, like, you're missing the period altogether, so you're kind of avoiding the whole problem altogether? And if you're just trying to fix part of it, that's why it's still one of the main treatments in the space. But most people don't believe it explains the mechanism of PMDD in and of itself, because again, the levels of progesterone in women with PMDD are actually very similar to those of women without PMDD, if not identical. And it's more the brain's response that explains it. So that theory kind of became quite unsatisfying. And so about 10 years ago, another theory arose to hopefully explain that disparity, and that's the serotonin or the 5-HT theory. So serotonin theory came from the fact that another alternative treatment that was used for PMDD is SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Most people know them from depression treatment. They're kind of standard grade antidepressants that you might be familiar with, and they can be used in intermittent or constant schedules for PMDD. So there are different ways of using it for PMDD, and they're generally quite effective. So they essentially increase the availability of serotonin in your brain, and kind of make sure that there is a little bit more serotonin in the brain. However, as people kind of dove into that deeper and realizing the fact that, okay, great, but serotonin is low in both people with depression as well as people with PMDD, but why does that change in response to hormones? There needs to be some link between serotonin and the hormone change, and why some people are sensitive, some are not. And it didn't quite explain that, because otherwise there wouldn't be that exact shared mechanism with major depressive disorder, except for the fact that people with depression have it all the time, and people with PMDD develop it only in the luteal phase. So then people were like, even if women with PMDD have lower serotonin levels, that's not the cause for their PMDD. It's probably a consequence. As a result of having PMDD, your serotonin levels lower. And so the most recent and the most prominent theory now in the field is the allo-GABA theory, which we will dive deeper, which kind of explains how PMDD might emerge in the brain itself. And so to break it down, how we got to that allo, which stands for allopregnanolone, which is another lesser heard of neurotransmitter in the brain, but it is one specific to PMDD. So for anyone who wanted to kind of think of one neurotransmitter linked to PMDD, allopregnanolone is the one to go for. Is that if you look at the breakdown patterns in the brain, so this is kind of how molecules get transformed from one into another in the brain, is that if we look at progesterone, is that progesterone can be broken down into 5-alpha DHP, you can see the intermediary here, and then ultimately gets broken down into allopregnanolone. The reason that's fascinating is because allopregnanolone is actually able to connect to the same receptors as GABA. And so GABA, for those of you who may or may not have heard of it, is one of the biggest and most prevalent neurotransmitters in the brain. It is the main inhibitive neurotransmitter, so it's the one responsible for making you feel kind of calm, relaxed, and generally in control. Its kind of flip side sister or brother is glutamate. So glutamate tends to be excitatory. It tends to make you want to move, be excited, and tends to be more regulated by, say, estrogen in the follicular phase. And then GABA is your relaxing neurotransmitter. So in people with regular menstrual cycles, everyone produces progesterone. It gets broken down into allopregnanolone, and allopregnanolone connects to GABA, and therefore is supposed to kind of increase these feelings of relaxation, calm, and potentially fatigue as well for some people as well, that we see the vast majority of women with kind of periods experience. The luteal phase is generally the slower phase of the menstrual cycle, and that is supposed to be the case, and that is what we would expect to happen. However, in women with PMDD, as some of you might know too well, instead of that connection being relaxing, it becomes paradoxically triggering. So it becomes that instead of being relaxed and calm, which you should be, you kind of start feeling anxiety, low mood, irritability, emotional instability, all of those feelings. And so we started noticing that, great, women with and without PMDD seem to have similar levels of progesterone that gets broken down into allopregnanolone, But then when it comes to the response to allopregnanolone and that specific connection to GABA receptors, something seems to be going weird in women with PMDD. And this is for the first time that we noticed a mechanism that seems to be hormone sensitive and specific to women with PMDD. That explanation of what's happening is not yet fully clear, but we are getting first glimpses from it. This is a study that just came out in late 2025 as well, so just a few months ago. So this is still very exploratory evidence, but it's a direction of where the field is heading up. And this is a study on mice. So it's not a real human study, because in humans, studying hormone channels and hormone receptors, hormone, but also neural channels and receptors is pretty much impossible. You need, a dead brain in order to study that or you need some model organism, and we still can't do that in most humans. But this is very, very exciting, because what they showed in the study is that between people who had severe sensitivity to allopregnanolone and those who didn't, there might be a difference in the way that your actual receptors for GABA are created. And specifically, they might have different subunits that you can read through here as well. And I'm not going to dive for the purposes of, keeping this accessible across the board. But the most important aspect to understand about it is that if there is a phase-dependent difference in the sensitivity of channels for different people with PMDD and without, that would explain why some people get PMDD and some don't at the very molecular and kind of chemical level, kind of being able to break that down. And if there is a difference in those channels, it means that that signal needs to be encoded genetically as well. So we could then start looking for the genetic traces of that encoding for that receptor as well. So this was an incredibly exciting study. And, is driving the direction of finally being able to connect why women with PMDD have a phase-dependent response to those hormones that seems to be paradoxical and different from other women as well. And I'm very excited to see where that research goes. But this is pretty much the end of how far science so far understands when it comes to the chemical or the neurotransmitter part of managing PMDD and understanding why some people get PMDD or not. However, the brain can communicate in two main ways. One of them is chemical, the one we discussed now via neurotransmitters, and the other one is electrical via what we call neural networks or the brain circuitry. So that's essentially, we zoomed in and looked at individual neurons in the brain and how they're built up from individual bits, but ultimately they need to all work together. A good way to imagine is that a neurotransmitter is kind of a task that you do during a day. You send a signal, you do something, maybe you write an email or something. And then the brain circuitry is kind of the CEO that manages all of the tasks that are happening in your company or, whoever your boss is and kind of around the place. So the brain circuitry is usually an electrical system that controls how neurons communicate with each other, where specific neurotransmitters get sent, why, at what severity and what frequency, et cetera, et cetera. So even though we know that, there's still some bits to figure out about PMDD at the neurotransmitter level, there are a couple of things that we have found out about what happens at the brain circuitry or that CEO level there as well. And here it's worth remembering that relationship between the limbic system and the frontal cortex. So I'll remind you that the limbic system, which you see here shown on the left, is the limbic system is responsible for, again, emotions, your core animal brain impulses, everything that you might feel and want to respond to immediately. And then your frontal lobe, which you will see in blue on the right, is essentially the part of your brain that helps you manage all of those emotions, helps you interpret them, and then respond accordingly. So essentially not get overly sensitive to them and respond appropriately as well. And as I mentioned, a critical part of a well-functioning brain across, the menstrual cycle, but also across life, is having the right balance between the two. Because the prefrontal cortex, so the executive function and control system, can't make a decision unless it has emotional inputs. It needs to know how you're feeling. So it needs to have communication bottom up from your limbic system to tell the brain how it's feeling. So it tells the frontal cortex, I'm in fear because I'm giving a public talk. I'm in fear because I'm about to do this thing I've never done before. And then on the other hand, you have to have top-down control from the prefrontal cortex over the limbic system that essentially says, okay, you might be very scared. Nothing's going to happen. You've done this before. You've done similar things before. You can't put yourself out there. And then they kind of regulate each other by the limbic system giving inputs to the prefrontal cortex and then the prefrontal cortex helping you interpret them. So the brain normally works on this balance, and that balance is very, very, very important. However, we see that in women living with PMDD, if you compare their brain function between the luteal and the follicular phase, so luteal when they're more sensitive, In the luteal phase, their actual activity that we can record with EEG scans shows reduced prefrontal regulation. So the bit that's supposed to help you regulate emotions is less active than it should be. At the same time, one of the subparts of the limbic system, so one of your emotional parts, the amygdala, which is responsible for fear response, tends to be hyperactive, so more active than it should be in the luteal phase. So what that means is essentially you have the control center that is not doing its job, it's less active than it should be, and then the input center being super heightened and sending more signals than it normally would. And in particular, for example, with example of amygdala, so someone who has a hyperactive amygdala is very likely to have symptoms of anxiety because essentially it's fear, it's the experience of fear, but without the prefrontal cortex explaining where the fear is coming from, it just keeps exacerbating and is not under any control. So your brain actually doesn't understand why it's in fear, but it's just in fear. And for people who have experienced symptoms of anxiety, that's kind of what anxiety feels like. You're fearful, you're distressed, but you don't know exactly why. You can't link it to a specific event. And if you resolve that event, usually anxiety doesn't immediately go away. It's this feeling of excess worrying and excess fear without a clear reason why. And that's often related to that feeling. So someone who might have PMDD with this specific pattern will likely experience symptoms of anxiety, but you can also experience symptoms of low mood and these irritability symptoms as well. And so we can see that at the broader level of how these neurons connect, they're not speaking that efficiently and they're not actually performing their jobs as well as they should be. It probably goes back down to, those all of those individual channels that we looked at and all of those different things. But ultimately, there is a high level control that is going awry that does reverse across cycle phases. And that's really unique to PMDD because we know that once you start your follicular phase, for most people, that relationship resolves and your prefrontal cortex is back in charge again. So that's really unique to these hormonal conditions as well. And so one of the things that we know is how do we measure that the prefrontal cortex isn't doing its job and how exactly is it not doing its job is by measuring different brain waves there. And we do that using electroencephalography. So that kind of measures brain waves in different regions of the brain. And one of the things that they notice there is that the alpha frequency, which generally indicates alertness and the ability to perform the job that the prefrontal cortex is supposed to do, is that in the luteal phase, you can actually notice that there starts to emerge an asymmetry in the prefrontal cortex of the brain. So your left and right prefrontal cortices are supposed to be talking to each other and helping that way control the limbic system. But in the luteal phase for women with PMDD, what they saw is that these two parts become asymmetrical. So the left hemisphere becomes less active and the right hemisphere becomes too active. And so the prefrontal cortex can't speak to itself. Therefore, it can't control the limbic system. And therefore, you get this emotional dysregulation that we see in people with PMDD. That's called alpha asymmetry. And you can see that demonstrated quite well in studies of women with PMDD and without. And that's actually the main difference that we can actually check relatively quickly. So even if you're someone with PMDD and have checked your hormones and your hormones seem fine, but you have this response to hormones, one of the things you could do is run an EEG scan with someone who's obviously trained in the space, and then essentially see whether you have that asymmetry. So essentially, whether your brain responds to hormones in a way that makes that your prefrontal cortex becomes asymmetrical and is no longer able to control your limbic system. And so the reason that's important is that that's the principle behind the use of neuromodulation in the treatment of PMDD and in the management of PMDD, is that you can wear neuromodulation devices that specifically modulate that electrical channel system. Neuromodulation is a technology that's been around for over 30 years. It's an approved treatment for clinical depression and is now emerging as a treatment in other areas, such as our device Nettle that is approved for PMS and menstrual pain. And essentially, it works on those exact regions of the brain. So in order to manage kind of mood symptoms, Nettle essentially stimulates the prefrontal cortex and literally puts in electricity into the left hemisphere, which is underactive, and routes it into the right hemisphere to restore that balance, to give you back charge and control over your luteal system as well. So that's really important because that's the thesis behind a lot of our work and research in PMDD, is because we know that in PMDD, even more so than in PMS, we do see that disparity in those levels of activity in the prefrontal cortex. And if we could balance them out, we can restore that control and therefore put you back in charge of your symptoms as well. And that's responsible for clinical efficacy as well. And the way that we do it is by also personalizing it, obviously, to your menstrual cycle and your needs, because every single person is very unique to their symptoms. And so now I'm going to briefly chat through some exciting but very preliminary data that we ran in a PMDD specific population. In our previous clinical trials, we ran specifically with populations that experience PMS or premenstrual syndrome because PMDD is so underdiagnosed. When we looked back at the data, 44% of participants actually did qualify for clinical grade PMDD. So that study may or may not be applicable for people with PMDD, but this study that I'm presenting today is the first one that we have run specifically with neuromodulation in people with PMDD only. And it was conducted in collaboration with Queen Mary University of London and led by researchers there. So we're still waiting for them to wrap up the study and finalize. But this is the early data we've received from them, which is incredibly exciting. In this study, we had 50 women with PMDD. Ideally, the vast majority of them had a formal clinical diagnosis, but in the cases where for some reason or other they couldn't have access to that diagnosis, we still wanted to make sure that the study was inclusive. So we still admitted women who had clinically met the criteria for PMDD. They needed to take no other treatment. So the only thing they're doing to manage their PMDD is the Nettle device. They have no history of drug abuse or use and no PCOS or endometriosis overlapping with their conditions here. The way that the study was ran is that we started with just measuring what the usual luteal phase looks like. Obviously, we needed to be very sensitive and make sure we measure it during the luteal phase so we get representation because the follicular phase is likely quite different. And then we had them use the Nettle device or a placebo device. So this was a fully double-blind, placebo-controlled randomized study. And then after 3 months of them using the Nettle device, we assess them again in their luteal phase and see whether their luteal phases have improved and their symptoms have improved as well. And so early data suggests that real stimulation does improve generalized anxiety much better than sham stimulation. And with the red stars, you can see when the significance level really reaches statistical significance. So you can see that the first month, people who received real stimulation are already better than those who received sham stimulation. But by month 2, that significance is really large, and that's maintained across the board as well. We also noticed that there was a significant impact on regulating emotions. We obviously, because the mechanism of action is based on making sure that we strengthen the prefrontal cortex to allow it to control the limbic system, we're very pleased to see that in our study as well, that the real device proved that much better than sham devices. We also saw that real stimulation reduces emotional reactivity to negative images. This is important because in this specific experiment, we essentially wanted to see that when people are presented with the same image, a lot of women with PMDD in their follicular phase will say that's a neutral image, and in their luteal phase will say that's something negative. And so here we are able to show that we reduce that negative bias by the use of Nettle over the 3 months. And obviously, we have some pain improvements as well over the 3 months, which are related to Nettle's approvals too, but less relevant for a PMDD population. And so on top of that clinical data, which is obviously incredibly great and allows us to better understand how it compares at the scientific grade level, those are still, clinical trials, which are very controlled. They can only admit some people with specific conditions. And we know that in the real world, women living with PMDD have a lot of other conditions. Many women with PMDD will also have some form of neurodiversity, such as ADHD or autism. A lot of women will have other symptoms, such as endometriosis or PCOS or whatever other condition they might have. So we wanted to also collect real world data of what it means to have Nettle as part of your general use from the users who have used Nettle over the last 3 to 12 months. And so here we asked the following questions. And what was very interesting is we saw that 80%, so 4 in 5 women who use Nettle see that they need fewer sick days or interruptions to daily life as a result of using Nettle. And in fact, we save an average woman of 2 days per month, every single month. And that's across the severity of symptoms that they might experience. We also noticed that with repeated use of neuromodulation, they change their medication use. The vast majority of women use fewer painkillers, which makes sense because Nettle reduces pain as well, pain perception. But also a quarter of women use fewer hormonal treatments. Those may be the women who've always wanted to move away from hormonal contraceptives, maybe trying to conceive or looking for alternative options there as well. But also quite a significant proportion of women reduce their use of antidepressants, which is likely linked to the fact that, as women are improving and are noticing that they need fewer doses or can get off antidepressants altogether, whether that be to manage their PMDD specifically or sometimes comorbid and overlapping depression as well. We also see that women tend to see their doctors a little bit less after starting to use neuromodulation. Usually it's because they found a solution that they were looking for, and we're continuing to monitoring to explain that better as well. And finally, if you are considering options across the board, obviously your doctor is always the first place to go to and to recommend the best option for your management of your PMDD and any other conditions you might overlap. If you are considering accessing neurotechnology for PMDD, Nettle is approved in Europe and the UK and can be prescribed by your doctor, but many doctors may not be aware. So if you are aware of this and have researched any form of technology in the space, you can tell your doctor about it. You can tell your other healthcare providers about it and tell your insurer or employee benefit program manager. And there's a lot of clinical data available that we are happy to share with them and educate them further as part of different courses and educational programs. Our team is led by neuroscientists, and we are supported by lots of different clinicians that can help you along the journey. But most importantly, we really want to put women first as experts in their own experience as well. So thank you so much for joining today. And it was my pleasure to share this hour with you.